He started having heart attacks when he was in his 40s. By the time he was 50, he had a talk out of the side of his mouth because half his body was paralyzed from a stroke. It's the result of a wild life. Drugs and booze. It was a different era, though. I mean, imagine like Thad Castle's grandpa. And that's really who we're talking about here. They call him Chuckles, Chuck. His name was Charles. My dad's dad, Charles Richardson. My dad was born in 1956 in Dayton, Ohio, to Chuck, and it was a tough family, tough situation. Charles was a sales rep at what's the name of it? Buckeye Bearing. Yeah, I guess sold like machine parts and ball bearings and stuff like that. My dad said he made pretty decent money doing that, and it took them all over. So they moved around a lot. My dad was in the Air Force, so we moved around a lot too. I understand what it's like to be the new kid. On the one hand, I really enjoyed being the new kid and getting to figure out a new environment and new people and make new friends. And on the other hand, like the older you get, the harder it is to let go, So my dad tells me a story of leaving Dallas, Texas, a place they'd lived for a few years. He was 10 or 11 years old. They packed the car up. It was time to go back to Ohio. They'd been around Topeka, Wichita. They lived all over, and so they were kind of making their way back up for work. Charles had to get back to Ohio, and my dad wouldn't get in the car. He said he'd started playing football there, finally had friends, felt like he had something going on there and wouldn't get in, and said they literally had to drag him into the car. And Ohio was an interesting life. So they had a house with a basement, pool table, and a bar down there. Chuck would have these parties. His friends would come over, they'd drink at the bar, they'd smoke, they'd shoot pool. The next day, my dad would go down there, 12 years old, and he'd pick up all the half-finished cigarette butts, take them under the stairs, and he'd smoke them. And then go shoot pool, because he had really nothing else to do. Chuck's wife left him, and he walked in one day with a new lady and her 3 boys, and eventually that became the new family. That woman adopted my dad, and she's a saint. She's a saint. And those boys had a lot of adventures. They got into trouble and learned to shoot pool together. My dad was really good young, and so my Chuck's friends would take my dad at 12, 13 years old to a dive bar to shoot pool with the intent of sharking people that were there. So they'd let old men come up to the table and play, and they'd bet on my dad, and he would take down these guys. And so he'd watch Chuck and his friends, raking it in and, taking their $50, $100. And I asked my dad if they ever cut him in on it, if he ever made money doing it. It's like, nah, not really. I was just so happy to be there. Sometimes they'd flick me $5, but it's not really why I was there. I just thought it was cool that I got to be there and do that. And sometimes they buy me a Coke and stuff. But yeah, Chuck was a hustler. He started having health problems and, needed to start coming up with other forms of income because it was getting hard to travel for work. So would just kind of, whatever they could figure out, they do. And my dad tells me the story of this one time Chuck and his friends load up an RV full of antifreeze. He knew that antifreeze was going for a lot more in Alaska, so they could mark it up, loaded it up, partied all the way to Alaska in this RV, sold all the antifreeze for a nice profit, sold the RV, and flew back to Ohio. That's the kind of guy he was. Well, he struggled with his health. I guess like the last half decade or so of his life, and he passed away at 51. Welcome to another episode of Insta Church. Happy Sunday to you. Just got right into it today. The question I have for you is, do you believe the story of Chuck, my dad, sharking guys in pool halls, living the good life, his time in Dallas? Is that something you would take at face value? If I told you that story, like I just did, and you didn't know me, would you believe it? I was asked after last week's Easter spectacular, where I stumbled my way through trying to help us all understand, if we haven't heard it, a little more about the historical basis for what we celebrated Easter. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and what that means for us, and the hope that offers, honestly. But I had a great question from somebody, I hope you're out there watching, that said, how can we rely on the Gospel of Mark? I had mentioned the earliest, it's thought that that's the earliest Gospel account, in written Gospel account. How can we rely on that when Mark was born 40 years after the death of Christ? That's a really good question. And I'm so glad that I can help, probably badly, help maybe explain that just a little bit. So just a little about the gospel. Like, what are we even talking about? Okay, the New Testament is it's essentially a biographical, historical, written testimony of the life of Christ and the birth and life of the church, the Christian church, the followers of Christ, and the Acts of the Apostles, what happened after the resurrection, the appearance of Jesus after having been crucified, and the tomb was found empty. He appeared to many. So it's the account of Christ's life, death, resurrection, and what happened after that, what grew out of that, the church that grew out of that, by eyewitnesses, by his closest disciples and apostles, people that were there, by historical figures around that, and then ends with Revelation, what many think is an account of a prophecy of the end of the world. It's the fullness of our understanding of the life of Christ and what's to grow out of that. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide the gospel narrative, and so you've got basically the synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning similar. All together, cohesive. They're a similar narrative that, side by side, are sort of a triple reiteration of the gospel narrative. Much of what they say aligns and sort of supports what the others are also saying. These are essentially eyewitness accounts, and then you've got the Gospel of John, which is quite different. I would say a little more poetic in nature. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was. So it's a different account, and all go together to explain the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ from the perspective of eyewitnesses. So who wrote these? So you've got Mark is considered to be the earliest gospel. And that was written under the authority of Simon Peter, one of the apostles, one of the disciples, the 12. So it's basically understood that it was assembled from the preaching and the testimony of Simon Peter, faithfully assembled that way. You've got John, one of the 12 disciples. You've got Matthew. So the first one that we have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. He was a tax collector, so he was tasked with keeping diligent records. So somebody that would have been a good candidate for this. And then you've got Luke, who was, and this is interesting. So Paul is considered an apostle by many. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples, but he did have an encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus that absolutely changed his life drastically. He went from a full-on enemy of Christians to a radical advocate of what Christ was calling people to, with a deep understanding of the faith. And so much of the New Testament, as I've talked about Paul a lot, much of the New Testament is owed to him in the letters of Corinthians, Philippians, and just a beautiful heart that man has that you can see in the letters. So Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. So although Paul wasn't one of the 12 disciples, he is considered one of the fathers of the Christian faith, and Luke was a highly trained, skilled, smart physician who worked diligently to make an accurate account of the things that happened. So we even have this before, where do I have it here? I wrote it down here somewhere. So, yes, here. Luke opens his gospel with this. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that had been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things which you have been instructed. It's Luke 1:1-4. The interesting thing about that is he wrote that, as I understand it, in, because I don't speak Greek, but, we stand on the shoulders of giants. As I understand it, he wrote that in a more formal Greek hand, which basically expresses that I am learned and capable and understanding of the nuances of the language and the customs, peoples, and times. I'm an educated man. I'm going to go ahead and prove that to you, that I can speak this way. And, this is somebody who's coherent, assembling these thoughts and arguments. And then the rest of Luke, he writes in a more common tongue to sort of explain these stories, make them more accessible to everybody. So I find that interesting. But that's who wrote the account of Luke. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now there's a couple points. There's a couple points to make in regards to whether or not those gospel accounts are reliable. And they go like this. So Greco-Roman historians at the time, you have to understand too, this is first century. Oral tradition is a sacred way of transmitting information, stories, especially about holy figures, important figures. It was done with great care and diligence. So, sometimes people make the comparison of like our telephone, as kids, and it's just not comparable because that tradition, the oral tradition, was something that was practiced and preserved and cared for. People were very careful about being true to people, places, dates, situations. So it's not like what we had here where it would fade every time somebody transmits the story. These accounts could be faithfully relied on, and we see that in Greco-Roman historians who, up to 150 years after the fact, would faithfully reconstruct events that had happened, and we rely on those. Nobody questions those, the accuracy of those. So one difficulty, one challenge that the gospel writers face is that it seems that critics of the gospel, they approach it from guilty until proven innocent. And that's not really the litmus test that most other historians face, where it's trusted until it's proven otherwise. It's really, in a lot of ways, unique to biblical writing. So it's just interesting how we seem to approach that. And although it should still stand under that test, so we want it to be tested historically, scientifically. But these Gospels were written at a time, not within 150 years, but within one generation, where, like in Mark's case, he was making an accurate account from the eyewitness testimony of a firsthand apostle. Just like my story, if Chuck is the Christ figure there, right? My dad is Peter, Simon Peter, who's preaching. He's telling me what happened. He's explaining that this is what his experience was. When it's so close in proximity to the subject, it doesn't have time to expand into legend, myth, folklore. It requires more generations for that to happen. But even in that culture of oral tradition, it was difficult for that to take place. And there's evidence of stories that take on that sort of legend, mythological bent. And those attributes are not present in these stories. There's the reliance of, there's the problem that the writers put themselves into, the corner they back themselves into when they use large groups in their stories, and there's lots of apostolic presence, so the disciples are there watching. It seems that there's always many eyes on these situations, including real historical figures. It would seem that if they were trying to fake these events, they would make these more isolated situations, but there always seem to be large crowds. So these stories being written and broadcast, this gospel account being told so close in proximity to the events themselves and the people and places that were there, make it very difficult to make the case that these were not reliable accounts. There was a track record of a historical reliability where outside of Christian scholarship, those that were enemies, I talked about this last week a little bit too, but those that were enemies of Christianities or had nothing to gain or could be embarrassed by the success of the Christian faith, historians like the Roman senator Tacitus, they made an account. They definitely spoke about the fact that there was a real Christ and that his followers were causing them causing them problems, and it's all very well documented. Nobody was arguing that Christ was not a real figure and these things didn't happen. So it aligns with the Gospel's narrative. So I think there's, you could look at it and say, like, is there confirmation bias here? Are we as Christians looking into this and hoping that this is true? But when you break it down, you compare it to oral tradition and how that was handled then, other historical figures, other historical documents at the time, the Greco-Roman style of taking account of biographies. This passes the litmus test on all accounts, really, with flying colors. Bart D. Ehrman, I got this here. Bart D. Ehrman, UNC religious studies professor, writes quite simply, the gospel writer's historical claims about Jesus as a historical figure, that he was a Jew with followers executed on orders of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, are born out of later sources with a complete set of biases. So there's a lot of reasons why we can believe this, that we can rely on this. These are essentially eyewitness or firsthand testimony, or written under the guidance of those people. And again, like I said last week, these same eyewitnesses, they didn't change their tune when there was a gun put to their head. They didn't change their tune. They took this all the way to their bloody deaths, being crucified upside down on a cross because they felt that they weren't worthy to be crucified in the same way. How many of us, if pressed for our beliefs, which are so flimsy these days, they're almost talking points. How many would you say you're so sure of your beliefs that if you were to be killed for that belief right now, you would still 100% without a shadow of a doubt say there's no room for error? Like, yeah, maybe there's, okay, maybe you're right. I gotta say, there's not many. Most things that we talk about are like, well, there's a little wiggle room here. Like, maybe you're right, to each his own. This was not that way. All these people died for this. So again, I believe that the deeper we dive, using reason, logic, history, science, that faith continues to meet it at an intersection of truth. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it now. That's a rough answer to that question. So I don't know if is Mark a reliable gospel account? If I told you that I never met my dad's dad, would you believe me?